Welcome to this explainer. Today, we are going to strip away centuries of romanticized myth and completely reconstruct the visceral, everyday reality of the medieval knightly class. To do this, we really have to challenge our preconceived notions of history and look closely at the actual, breathing human beings sealed inside that armor. I mean, when you think of a knight, do you picture a wealthy, romantic, in gleaming steel, totally unbothered by mundane struggles? Because the historical reality was just vastly different. It was a grueling life, completely defined by suffocating heat, crushing financial stress, and a genuinely brutal social hierarchy. Section 1. The Knightly Paradox, Enforcers of the Feudal Order. So the absolute foundation we need to establish is that knights were definitely not just wandering freelance adventurers. They were the professional, heavily armored enforcers of a very rigid political hierarchy, bound by strict legal contracts of land and violence. The whole engine behind this was something called the knight's fee, basically a grant of land or a fief given by a monarch or a higher lord. In exchange for that land, the warrior owed their sworn loyalty and mounted military service. They were quite literally the military backbone of local governance. But here is where we hit a profound contradiction. The famous code of chivalry demanded the protection of the weak, right? Yet the systemic reality of their world actually required brutalizing the peasantry to maintain their grip on power. The historical consensus shows us a class of men bred for war, whose very livelihood depended on extracting labor and rent from the lower classes, very often through sheer intimidation. Section 2. Forging the Armored Body, a Lifetime of Biomechanical Conditioning. To actually survive in this incredibly violent world, physical conditioning had to begin in early childhood. Imagine being a noble boy of just 7 years old, essentially removed from your family to serve as a page and learn basic combat. Then, by 14, you become a squire, actively managing massive war horses and hauling armor. Finally, at 21, if you survived all of that, and if you possessed the necessary wealth, you were dubbed a knight. It was a grueling 14-year apprenticeship in the pure mechanics of trauma. And the lived reality of this training was intensely sensory. Long before they ever held a lance, squires intimately knew the suffocating heat of padded arming garments. This was not glamorous work at all. They performed highly technical labor, learning exactly how to dry caustic sweat from a helmet's textile lining without letting a single drop of moisture touch the steel. Their daily lives were steeped in the heavy odors of horse sweat, damp wool, and oiled iron. Because of this, the biomechanical reality of these warriors was frankly astonishing. Wearing about 60 pounds of tailored steel, elite warriors like Boucicaut performed these incredible acrobatic feats. They treated their armor as an agile extension of their own bodies. Historical records actually detail training regimens where men scaled the underside of ladders using only their arm strength, or vaulted onto galloping horses without even using stirrups. A perfectly tailored harness distributed that 60 pounds flawlessly. Out on the battlefield, perched atop a massive destrier warhorse, the famous lance charge was really just a fleeting, thunderous moment of shock. The lance was effectively a one-shot weapon. Driven into an opponent at full gallop, it shattered instantly. And right then, the knight was forced to draw a sword or a mace, plunging straight into a claustrophobic, exhausting struggle, where they had to leverage blunt force against the tiny weak points in enemy armor. Section 3. The Price of Chivalry, Socioeconomic Stratification. Now, it's crucial to realize that not every knight possessed a grand castle. The historical record reveals a really stark contrast. Many knights were entirely landless, unmarried men who slept communally on the drafty stone floors of a great hall. These household knights were essentially highly trained elite bodyguards who owned nothing. Their absolute survival was tied completely to the patronage of a wealthier, manor-dwelling lord. 40 days. That was the typical mandatory annual military service a knight owed to his lord, and it was fulfilled completely at his own staggering expense. Being a knight meant constantly hemorrhaging wealth to maintain your armor, your weaponry, and a stable of highly specialized horses. That single obligation could easily wipe out up to a year's worth of income. The financial pressure was so immense, in fact, that many eligible landowners literally refused knighthood just to avoid completely ruining themselves with debt. Instead, they opted to pay something called scutage, a shield money tax that allowed them to commute their required military service. They literally bought their way out of going to war, which then allowed the crown to just go out and hire more willing mercenaries in their place. Section 4. Feasting and Foraging, the Fuel of a Warrior. Let's talk about food, because a knight's survival was deeply circumstantial and dictated entirely by where they were. At home on the estate, a landed knight consumed fresh, roasted venison and wildly expensive imported spices like saffron. But the absolute second they marched out on campaign, all of that luxury vanished. Suddenly, they were surviving on hard, twice-baked biscuit, dried stockfish, and heavily salted pork flavored only with a sharp acidic liquid called verjuice. And you can forget about modern nutritional science or balanced diets here. Their formidable physical conditioning was fueled by vast quantities of fatty meat and weak beer. If we look at the dietary records of figures like Earl Percy, a typical morning meal was massive chunks of boiled beef or mutton served right on top of coarse trencher bread. Medieval nobles actively avoided leafy greens, genuinely believing them to be beneath their status. Food was a raw display of power, and meat was the ultimate symbol of that power. But the environment they lived in dictated a very strict systemic reality. To replenish the soil, medieval farmers had to utilize a 3-year crop rotation, meaning they planted legumes every second year. The ripple effect of this was huge. It meant that, regardless of your wealth or status, field peas and broad beans were the inescapable foundational protein for everyone, from the highest knight down to the lowest peasant. The very earth they walked on dictated the exact fuel in their stomachs. Section 5. The Rules of Romance, Courtly Love, and Its Contradictions. Finally, we have to look at the paradoxical landscape of the knightly heart. You see, noble marriages of this era were largely loveless business transactions, designed purely for political alliances and acquiring land. So, to try and separate chivalry from mere savagery, the courts cultivated fin amours, courtly love. It was an elaborate, highly ritualized literary game where knights were expected to show a fragile, poetic, and utterly consuming devotion to an unattainable and very often married noblewoman. Medieval writers like Andreas Capellanus essentially argued that true love demanded secrecy, physical hardship, and deep suffering simply to earn a lady's favor. It's almost a theatrical contradiction when you think about it. A man who spent his entire morning shattering iron armor with a heavy mace was then expected to spend his evening pining, trembling, and composing delicate poetry. They existed in a world where duty and desire were fundamentally opposed to one another. So, as we wrap up this explainer, we're left with a truly fascinating contradictions that completely defined the lived experience of the Middle Ages. To understand them, we really must look beyond that gleaming armor to see the complex, pressured human beings underneath. They were brutal enforcers tied to the land, supreme athletes fueled by meat and beer, and violent warriors totally desperate for a veneer of refined romance. When you look at the harsh realities of our past, which part of this knightly existence actually surprises you the most?